I wanted to talk about a piece of correspondence that showed up in my email, which suggests another landscape of horror.
Oh, good.
So actually, Jen,
Today in Landscapes of Horror.
if you would show the email that I received from a reporter at the BBC. Okay, so the letter reads, "Dear Bret Weinstein," that's me, by the way. That's not in the letter, I was just commenting. "I am a journalist with the BBC World Service Languages Disinformation team.
Ooh.
Based in the UK. We are currently looking at the disinformation being amplified on, quote, the Diary of a CEO podcast. We have found that in the episode you were invited to, you shared false information, which, if followed, could lead to patient harm, i.e., negative outcome for those following that advice. We plan to publish a story on the BBC's platforms in England and by BBC... in English, right, which is what they speak in England, so it's related, and by BBC World Services in other languages, and would like to provide you with the opportunity to respond to our findings. Specifically, we are likely to make reference to the following. Before appearing on the podcast, you spread climate change conspiracies and anti-vaccine conspiracies, among many others."
Could you?
I know. On the podcast, you promoted 17 harmful claims.
Prime, anyway.
These include widely debunked statements such as that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are more effective than the COVID-19 vaccine, and that the COVID vaccine was a kind of gene therapy. I know. We would be grateful for a written response.
Well, but wait a minute. So harmful. They didn't say that those were disinformation, actually. They just said they're harmful.
We would be grateful for a written response by no later than 17 o'clock GMT, UK local, on the 28th of November, 2024. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me, Jacqui Wakefield. Now, I will say, Jacqui Wakefield gets a point.
Does she?
Yes, she does get a point. She actually reached out, and she actually gave me enough time for me to respond to her. Not a ton of time, but enough time that I could, in principle, write back to her. Now, what she would do with what I wrote back, I don't know. But I do, as much as I find this ridiculous, the opportunity to actually respond is journalistically responsible. And so anyway, Jacqui, thank you for doing that. I do want to say that she is part of an endeavor. I've lost track of the title of it, but she is effectively on the BBC's disinformation beat, which is preposterous on its face, right? This is just more of the same bullshit that we saw at the Stanford Internet Observatory and the ill-fated Ministry of Truth. The whole idea that there's a group of people who are possessed of the facts, who are in a position to say who amongst us is speaking about things that are counter to the facts, is, of course, insane on its face.
Yep.
The facts are something that we arrive at having had a vigorous discussion in which different perspectives that can't be reconciled are allowed to compete with each other. And we discover, frankly, Jacqui, I don't know if you know this, but the test is who has predictive power. That's how we know which facts are correct, not because we looked them up on some official looking website in which the CDC told us what was true or something like that, which is presumably the method that you are using.
The CDC, which during COVID at one point, the head of it admitted that she was getting her information from CNN.
Right.
So it's a circle jerk at best.
A circle jerk at best. We're going to try not to name the episode that, but in any case. So, I find something interesting about this. For one thing, that episode of Diary of a CEO has been widely circulated and very well received in a lot of different quadrants. I was not aware of Diary of a CEO until they invited me to go on the program. I was very impressed with what they did. And so they came to LA, they flew me down, and were very well researched on topics that I was interested in. The host, Stephen Bartlett, was excellent at engaging in dialogue, giving good pushback. Anyway, I thought it was a great podcast. And the audience seems to have really liked it as well. Maybe
Kind of fascinating because, as you said, you hadn't heard of them, and there's just not that much overlap before then between what has become your and some degree our audience and what is their audience. So
Right.
it's a great way to actually cross foster and like actually have conversations across significant differences, if you will.
It used to be something we talked about at Evergreen before Evergreen melted down. But yeah, and in fact, this, I believe, it addresses one of the major mysteries here, which is this podcast didn't just emerge. This podcast came out in August.
Oh.
And somehow now the BBC has decided to report on all of this dangerous misinformation and conspiracy theories.
Well, I'm sure they're backlogged. There's a lot of disinformation to cover.
Well, I suppose. But I think what's really going on here is that this actually was a crossover episode. You know, if you or I go on Joe Rogan's podcast, most of the audience is already familiar with the heterodox take, and it won't be the first time that they've heard skepticism about things that the New York Times assures them are true and all of that. So how much danger does it pose? Well, a lot less than going on a major British podcast where the audience is much less familiar with these things. So maybe the thing to do is actually to show a couple of clips from this podcast so people can get the sense that this was not a, you know, wild-eyed, uncareful, you know, romp through conspiracy land. This was a reasoned discussion, and that what Jacqui Wakefield is suggesting is the promulgation of conspiracy theories was a discussion about these things. You know, the usual kind of self-skeptical discussion that you get here on Dark Horse or when you and I go on other podcasts. It was us being careful scientists and, you know, yes, discussing heterodox ideas, but doing so carefully. So let's show a clip or two.
And what mission are you on? And when I ask that second question, I'm looking at the full body of your work and I'm trying to encapsulate it maybe in just a couple of sentences.
Sure. I am an evolutionary biologist. Okay. So anyway, you get the sense of what Stephen Bartlett is like, and I found him to be not just very good at his job as podcast host, but also kind of a lovely person who is deeply interested in things and deeply concerned about the well-being of Earth and civilization and his audience and all of that. All right. Do we have another clip? I've done a lot of thinking about the game theory of human competition. And one thing has struck me in recent years, which is that there's a reason that communism continues to reemerge. It doesn't work, so why would people keep landing there? And I think it is unfortunately the natural consequence of a meritocracy that does not take care of those who lose. If you have a meritocracy where the way to have a decent life is to figure out how to provide something that people want, right? But you don't have a plan for the people who try that and it doesn't work for whatever reason, then what you will end up with is a large number of people who will correctly understand that they are on the losing end of a bargain. Those people don't have an investment in keeping that system running. They want to overturn it. And in fact, with some cause, they will look at all of the fortunes that have been created in that meritocracy, and they will say, do you realize how much of that is illegitimate? Do you realize how much of that was parasitic? We want it back. And so I think communism is, you know, game theoretically, it can't be made to work. It has a fundamental flaw at its heart, which is that it punishes those who contribute and it rewards those who don't. Such a system will inherently be unproductive. Good. Okay, so you get the sense of the tone, and it was a long podcast. It was 3 hours, and we covered a lot of topics, including concerns that have been aired here on Dark Horse about, you know, the danger that the sun cycles pose to planet Earth, skepticism about the conventional climate narrative. All of these things And we talked a lot about COVID and what happened to civilization as a result of it, and what sorts of technologies were imposed on us and what their physical harm was and all those things. And you can see in Jacqui Wakefield's letter to me that she just simply takes the conventional wisdom as if it were simply true, right? She says that I trafficked in the idea that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine work better than, quote, the COVID vaccines. Well, I'm sorry, Jacqui. There is evidence that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin do work better than the so-called COVID vaccines. In fact, I would ask you to look into Norman Fenton and Martin Neal's work on what they call the cheap trick.
Right.
Now, the cheap trick, which you are undoubtedly unaware of, is the mechanism by which the efficacy of the so-called vaccines was simulated, right? And what it involved was a statistical manipulation in which, by counting people as unvaccinated until they were 2 weeks out from the vaccination process, all of the COVID that they came down with was credited to the unvaccinated group, which creates something above 80% apparent efficacy for vaccines. And it would do so even if those vaccines contain nothing but saline. It has nothing to do with the impact of the vaccines themselves.
So I will say, in case Jacqui Wakefield wants to find that, I find that we talked about that in episode 185 in an episode we called Why Would They Lie About That? And that will link to Fenton and Neal's work.
Yes. So in any case, yeah, what you think is a fact about the efficacy of the mRNA COVID vaccines was actually a trick that was played on the public. And you will find similar tricks were played to produce the impression that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine did not work on COVID. Now, if you had been a viewer of Dark Horse, you would know that actually there's every reason to expect that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine would be effective on the basis that they are highly effective across mRNA viruses. And B, you would know that even the studies that are used to portray them as ineffective, if you look past the presentation of those studies into the actual evidence, the data within those studies, you will find that even though the studies were badly structured, they were effectively self-sabotaging studies, that the efficacy was high enough that it showed even in those data sets. So I'm not telling you what to believe. What I'm telling you is that if you think the truth is simply over here and that I somehow am either unaware of the truth or am dishonest about what I know, you are misunderstanding how it is we come to find out what is true. That is a process from which there is no cheat sheet. There is no institution that can hand you a list of the things that are simply true and that you can depend on. And any understanding of the history of science would tell you this, right? What we now understand to be the truth about everything, including the Earth going around the sun, was once thought to be misinformation. So what the hell are you doing with your life, right? You have decided to become the finger-wagging hall monitor of truth because you think you can look it up somewhere? No, you can't. And you are not doing the public a service. Now,
that is what we would have expected to be downstream of the way that children are taught in school now, right?
Right.
That knowledge comes from the authority who already has the knowledge and from the books on the shelves. That is where knowledge comes from, not from personal discovery and creativity and direct experience.
Not from a process.
Right.
It is the process that matters. And one of the reasons that you will find that Heather and I take the approach we do, that I took the approach that I did in the podcast that you're analyzing, is because people need to see that process in order to understand what they could possibly trust.
Yes.
Right? Not here is what I believe to be true and you should believe it, but here is what I believe to be true and here is how I arrived there.
And
here's the point at which my position changed and here's the thing that changed it.
More even to the point then, so that people can know what they can trust, so that people can learn to execute the process themselves. Because we all almost every single human being has the capacity to think scientifically in this regard. And that doesn't mean that we're expecting that everyone is going to go out and start running PCRs. No, it's this process of both induction and deduction and falsification and prediction by which you arrive at answers that you become ever more certain, without ever being actually certain, that you have probably arrived at the right answer because you have tried and tried and tried to falsify your most cherished beliefs. Like, this is what we all need to be doing. And if COVID didn't reveal that to you or anyone else, then you probably ended up making some decisions that even if you don't regret them now, you will, because we got sold a whole bill of goods about what was right for us and what was wrong. And pretty much always it was backwards.
Yeah, backwards and dangerously so. Mm-hmm. And I want to switch from the COVID narrative to the climate narrative, which she takes me to task here. Now, I have not gone back to the podcast and listened to what I said, but I certainly know what my position is. And so I know from what it will have been derived. What I have said many times is that I believe the Arrhenius equation is correct. The Arrhenius equation tells us that there is a heat trapping capacity of certain things, including CO2. Okay? So the fact that we are elevating CO2, which is not toxic, but it is a product of industrial processes like internal combustion, will tend to trap more heat. All else being equal, the increase in CO2 will trap more heat. That does predict a certain amount of warming. Is it enough to matter? Does it dominate other things like solar forcing? We don't know. That's an open question. But am I denying the Arrhenius equation? No. In fact, I'm one of the few people I know who ever mentions the Arrhenius equation. I also say, while I am highly skeptical that the field of climate science is capable of giving us an honest accounting because it will penalize anybody who says things aren't as bad as we fear, that there are things that do tell us where we are in this process. I've pointed to glacial retreat. Is there glacial retreat? There is. Is the glacial retreat a match for what we've been led to understand? No. I keep being promised an ice-free Arctic. It never happens. I keep being promised that Mount Kilimanjaro will lack glaciers. It doesn't. I keep being told that Glacier National Park will also lack glaciers. It hasn't happened. So, is there global warming? Yes. Is it the result of human activity? Undoubtedly, some of it is. Is it important? We don't know. Are we being led to believe that it is much more important than other things that actually threaten us a great deal more? Yes, and if you listen to the entire podcast with Stephen Bartlett, you will know what I think we should be worried about. And you will also know that I think there is a major unknown in the entire landscape that people have to be worried about, which is you cannot extrapolate linearly from something like glacial retreat and understand what the hazard of frozen methane in the Arctic might be for humanity. It is possible to have a gradual, not very important warming process that results in the so-called methane gun hypothesis, the sudden release of massive amounts of methane that change the temperature in ways that will be completely outside of human control. So do I think that's going to happen? I do not. But do I believe it is a possibility? Yes. And I talk about it. Why? Because I'm trying to show people what you do when you're dealing with an actual complex system. How do you think about these things? And what do you do when your information is compromised by broken fields and bad institutions? You know, you have to reason through this stuff yourself. So if you're thinking that I'm irresponsible, you are misunderstanding what landscape you're in. Now, go ahead.
Well, that's brilliant. And I actually just wanted to tie it back to what we were talking about in the first part of the podcast, which is where I didn't get in being deeply concerned about attempts by tech utopians to control how much methane cows are producing, is that entire thing hinges on we need to reduce methane because methane is the culprit, because climate change is the biggest existential threat facing humanity, and it's anthropogenic, and we aren't allowed to discuss whether or not any of that is true. Regardless of whether or not it's true, once you have that conclusion, you have, again, a gameable system in which, we can start selling carbon credits to people. We can put any number of businesses can spring up to supposedly reduce the thing that everyone has now acknowledged we have to reduce, even if it's not true. And you're going to mess with the cows, you're going to mess with the humans who are eating the cows, you're going to mess with the ecosystems, all in service of this one false god, which is reducing carbon in the atmosphere. Even if it's not a false god, it's one thing among many that we need to be concerned about. And whenever, even if it's true, even if reducing the methane would reduce the anthropogenic climate change sufficiently that we could get ahead of other things that, that the Chicken Littles with regard to climate change are claiming are going to happen, even so, it can't possibly be true that focusing almost entirely on that one thing is going to lead us to a better and more productive future.
And actually, Jacqui Wakefield, you are involved in an auxiliary business. You are trying to police information. And I think what you're doing here, whether or not you understand it, I don't know whether you gave yourself this assignment or somebody decided to assign this project to you, but why is it that so many months after this podcast was released and well received, you're writing this expose? Well, I have a guess. My guess is that something understood that having somebody who does engage in this in a responsible way, who talks about the failure of the institutions, and who believes that we absolutely need institutions that do not fail in this way, and talks about the scientific process that allows us to figure out which models have predictive power and which ones lack predictive power, that having such a person talk about their own skepticism regarding what we're being told over climate change or vaccine safety and efficacy, right, that must not be allowed to encounter large new audiences of people who haven't heard it carefully presented, because in order to control those people, you have to keep them in the mindset that people who talk about these things are out of their gourds. So I don't think you're going to have any impact on me at all by writing this. But I think what you're doing is you're punishing Stephen Bartlett for talking to me, because his audience has now heard somebody talk about these things in sober, scientifically rigorous terms, and that can't be, now can it? So you are part of an industry, and frankly, I think you've got to repent. Now, I did some looking. I tried to find more information on what you've been doing with your life, and frankly, there wasn't very much. So I know that you're part of this effort to police misinformation, preposterous and insane, and frankly immoral on its face. You live in the West. Free speech is an important value. But what I did find was an article on another topic that gave us a clue as to from what mindset you emerge. Can you put up the this article that Jacqui Wakefield is responsible for? Okay. Far-right videos distorting the truth of the Bangladesh minority attacks. Now, there's a lot to be said about this story, but I just want to focus on the emphasis on the idea of far-right videos. Far-right is a prejudicial term that is being used in this case on an article that you wrote, and to be fair, I cannot say that you wrote the title. Often that is not the case, but the fact is, this is a article designed to scare people away from one perspective and towards another. Your obligation as a journalist is to present them the facts so that people can evaluate their own perspective on them. But instead, you're stigmatizing one perspective by portraying it as far right, and as people who actually emerge from the left, who are routinely dismissed as far right by people who do not want audience to listen to us. This is a easily recognized tactic. So the last thing I will say is that you exist in a profession that has an obligation to inform people so that they can evaluate the truth of things. What you are doing is you are presenting them with an officially sanctioned set of beliefs and attempting to demonize those who have an alternative perspective. It is a violation of the most basic principles of journalism. And on a more personal note, it is at best a complete waste of your life. You're going to go around telling people who understand topics far better than you do that they've got it wrong because somebody in an official position told you that that was the case. That's not how any of this works. So please get over yourself. And if this is being handed to you by bosses, tell them to go fuck themselves.
This is a product that has been approved by the US FDA already, although there are some competing products, which we'll also talk about, which are even more impressive, apparently. So